So did anyone travel from far, like Melbourne or Brisbane or another city? Yeah, where'd you come from?
Raleigh, North Carolina, USA.
North Carolina, USA. I think I might beat you though. Anyone else? No, all from Sydney?
You win.
Well, so Melbourne, all right. Did you get caught up in the, oopsie, I went through the wrong gate fiasco?
No.
Okay. Oh, great. That was a disaster.
What did you get caught up in?
No. I came Vancouver, Sydney. From Amsterdam. I went that way around. It's a way.
14 hours?
That was Vancouver, Sydney. Amsterdam, Toronto was 8. Toronto, Vancouver was 5. Oh, and I had a 3-hour delay. Hooray. So I really, really wanted to be here today. Yeah, exactly. That's why I came last week. Caught up with some caught up with some friends and stuff. All right, so we are on time now, about 1 minute past, so that's fine, perfect. So I will get started. So good morning, my name is Adele Carpenter and I'm a software engineer at Trifork Amsterdam. Most of my day I spend building and maintaining Java and Kotlin applications for the educational sector. And yeah, you did hear that right, based in Amsterdam, came via Canada, but this is most definitely an Australian accent, although these days you might catch me saying duvet, flip-flops and ketchup. Please don't hold that against me. The first time I said ketchup in front of my dad, he looked at me like I was an alien. He was like, "Who are you? This is a tomato sauce household." Anyway, this is a long way of saying that I'm just really excited and a little bit nervous to give this talk in front of a home crowd. So quickly, the format of today's talk, it's going to be a little bit different from talks you'll see at this conference and that you've seen at other conferences, because I'm going to be exploring case studies in a storytelling format, and then we'll pull out some lessons that we can apply to software development. So there is a little bit of drama, and you do need a little bit of imagination. So are you ready? Yes. Come on, are you ready? Yes. That's better. Now I know that you're ready. Great. So our first case study begins on September 8th, 1989. It's 4:25 p.m. and Partnair Flight 394 from Oslo to Hamburg has just hit its cruising altitude just off the coast of Denmark. The first officer on this flight is Finn Peter Berg, who's only 4 months away from retirement. He has been flying the majority of his adult life, and even though he still loves flying, he is looking forward to his retirement. He's just getting tired of all of the ancillary crap associated with being both a pilot and a flight operations manager for a struggling charter flight company. He wants less stress at work and more time with his grandkids. And what kind of stress is he under? Well, 45 minutes earlier, he was arguing with the in-flight caterer over overdue catering bills, of all things. The situation was so bad that the flight would not be cleared to depart unless the bill for this flight was settled. So Berg does the only thing that he can, which is open his wallet and pay the bill with his own money. That's annoying in and of itself, but this incident came after he had already spent some time with his flight mechanic trying to resolve an issue. The left AC power generator was not working, and without 2 working generators, they would not be cleared for takeoff. Eventually, they decided to use the backup generator. These issues caused the flight to be delayed by an hour. But by now, this is all dealt with, so Berg is relaxing into the cruise. He looks over to the captain, his good friend of 30 years. The captain looks back at Berg knowingly, and they both chuckle and roll their eyes. Thousands of flying hours experience apiece and still stressing over catering. Even in the 1980s, the golden days of aviation were well and truly over. At this point, Berg notices another aircraft approaching at high speed between 2 layers of cloud. He points out, "Look, it's your 11 o'clock. An F-16, the captain replies, as the jet zooms overhead. But let's move back now a few metres into the cabin. And here, in contrast to the cockpit, the atmosphere is buzzing. Half of the head office of the Norwegian shipping company, Wilhelmsen, are on their way to officially name the latest ship in the fleet, the Topaz. And with limited places, all 50 passengers had to win their seats. So everyone is in a great mood, free flight, and they enjoy the onboard service. And in the back of the cabin, we find 44-year-old Turid Birkeland. She's on the flight as a reward for 26 years of service at Wilhelmsen, and she's going to be the ship's godmother. This is an honour which requires her to write and give a speech at the ceremony. So you can imagine her just sitting there in the back of the plane, scribbling feverishly in a notebook, her glass of champagne dancing on the tray table as she writes. But when she stops writing for a moment, she notices that her glass is still dancing. If anything, it's dancing more vigorously. She's never flown in a plane with propellers before, so she just assumes that that is part of the experience. Suddenly, the glass flies off the tray table and smashes into the window next to her. The nose of the plane has turned violently to the right as if it were pushed. Turid feels herself being pulled towards the ceiling of the cabin, but thankfully she is held in place by her seatbelt. However, a flight attendant that's in the middle of serving drinks is not so lucky. She crashes into the ceiling and looks to be badly injured. Panicked, Turid notices something in the corner of her eye. She looks out the window and sees a large piece of metal flash past, the wings. Wingless, the plane accelerates rapidly downward, and within seconds it crashes into the sea below. None of the 55 souls on board survive, leaving behind grieving families and a broken shipping company. So let's fast forward a bit. It's July 1993, 4 years since Flight 394 went down. I can see the lead investigator, Finn Heimdall, he's sitting down his, IBM PS2 computer at the head office in the Accident Investigation Board of Norway, opening up WordPerfect to put the finishing touches on the flight investigation report. He then stares at the screen, his index finger is hovering above the keyboard, muttering to himself, "Where's the sea?" before typing his current train of thought. It's the early 90s, he's in his mid-50s, computer skills, computer literacy wasn't its highest in that population at that point in time. So Finn pauses for a moment and he, sits back in his chair, he takes a deep breath, and he stretches his arms overhead. And as he exhales and lowers his arms, the true magnitude of the last 4 years seemed to bear down on him all at once. Because not even Finn, a highly experienced investigator who's seen it all, could have predicted the long chain of events that led up to Crash 394. So he sits there and he thinks back to the first few days of the crash. Not a lot is known at that point, except that the plane disappeared from radar after making a short, sharp turn to the right. Several bodies are quickly recovered, along with floating aircraft debris some distance away. The larger distance gives a clue that the plane broke up midair. So already at this point, Finn has two possible theories, and let's follow his process. So he knows about the F-16 spotted in the area just before the crash. So could a sonic boom of the jet cause the plane to disintegrate into midair? And less than a year ago, Pan Am Flight 103 was shot down over Lockerbie, Scotland. So did an act of terror bring the plane down? Both theories are compelling enough for the media to circulate them widely. Their readers seem to want answers just as much as the victims' families. The pressure is on. Finn and his team get to work analysing the debris field on the seafloor, and after the few days, they have a detailed map. So sure enough, the tail is far away from the main wreckage, so both theories are still possible, a breakup in midair caused by one of these two things. But not long after this discovery and following intense media pressure, the military presents an affidavit from the F-16 pilot. He swears that he was flying at least 1,000 feet away from Flight 394, and therefore any sonic boom could not have impacted the flight in any way. And this being Denmark, where they trust the government, is enough to ensure the public and Finn that the military was not involved. A bomb or missile strike in the rear of the plane is looking increasingly likely. Emotions are understandably running high. Finn sends parts of the wreckage for analysis for explosive residue, a logical next step given the evidence that he has so far. His hands tremble slightly as he opens the envelope. His worst fears appear to be confirmed. There are indeed traces of explosive residue on the aircraft. But before Finn can even really process this information, the media publish details of the report. They're certain terrorists did this. But Finn, not quite sure. Of course, he wants to wrap up the investigation quickly, but he knows that doing his job right means removing any and all doubt associated with his findings. So the next morning, Finn gathers his team and he asks, how can we prove ourselves wrong? What details might we be ignoring because they don't match the bomb theory? And what else could cause a mid-air breakup? To answer the first question, someone on the team suggests a more detailed analysis of the blast residue. Like, what are the exact levels? Is it what we would expect from a bomb on a plane? Could there be other potential sources of the residue? Finn agrees and asks two of his team members to follow up. In response to the second question, another team member points out that so far no terrorist groups have claimed credit for the attack. If terrorists had done this, they would likely claim credit. And there are many things that could cause a mid-air breakup. So the best bet to reduce the scope is the black box, which is almost ready for analysis. Indeed, further examination of the blast residue on the wreckage reveals that the quantities present are just too small to have been caused by an explosion on the aircraft. In fact, the difference is orders of magnitude. So the bomb theory is looking less likely. But that still leaves the question, if not from a bomb, then what? Eventually, Finn and his team determined that the residue likely came from the seafloor. Historically, many battles had been fought off the coast of Denmark, and the residue is likely from old ammunition and weapons that had drifted down from the surface. This is a really unsatisfying answer, but it is the most likely explanation. And thanks to the commitment of Finn and his team to finding the root cause of the crash, the victims' families are one step closer to finding the truth or getting answers. They might feel angry at having to wait and scream fake news, but Finn's discipline in questioning himself and his team thoroughly and ruthlessly, in my opinion, is to be admired. The temptation to blame terrorists in the face of intense pressure would just be too real. And in software engineering, unlike air crash investigations, we don't often have the priority or luxury of vast resources to find the root cause of an issue. But we still face intense pressure from external sources such as managers or customers to find a solution for a pressing technical issue. And we face the temptation to implement the first solution that fits. In those moments, we can take a leaf out of Finn's book when we have a compelling theory by questioning ourselves. How can I prove myself wrong? What details might I be ignoring because it doesn't fit my theory or solution? What else could cause this issue or situation? These are also really great questions to throw into meetings for example, if it's not your area of expertise, but you would like to help your team. And perhaps they're even more helpful if it is your area of expertise, because experience has a funny way of hiding our blind spots from us. So we're back in Norway. Finn and his team just ruled out 2 potential causes of the crash, and they're low on leads. Thankfully, the black box is ready for analysis, which obviously is orange and contains not 1 but 2 recording devices, which have highly original names. Does anyone know them, the names of the 2 devices? Yeah, at the back? Very close, cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. And I have a bonus question because we've got this very special Australian edition. Does anyone know the name of the Australian who invented the black box? No? I actually had to look this one up too. So it was David Warren, a research scientist at the Aeronautical Research Laboratory in Melbourne. So yeah, sorry Sydney, this one does go to Melbourne. Although David went to school at Trinity Grammar, so I guess you can share the credit on this one. Anyway, unfortunately for Finn and his team, the voice recorder is a dead end. There is some pre-flight discussion recorded, including the first officer complaining about having to pay the catering bill. But as the engines power up, the recording mysteriously stops. So that leaves just the data recorder, which is not exactly a dead end. It's just epically confusing. This is an older mechanical recorder, which the nail just moves up and down on a metal tape. As you can see in the image here, you've got the metal stylus or the needle, and then the metal tape running through it. And it's kind of like a needle and paper on an old school heart monitor or a seismograph. Anyway, that's not the confusing part, because Finn's seen those before, because, you know, he's a professional. What's strange about it is that there is a double line for the altitude reading, both immediately before the crash and intermittently in several of the flights before. A double line like the one you can see here is, in fact, highly unusual. So unusual, in fact, that Finn needs to send the data recorder to the manufacturer in the US, who in turn needs to call an expert out of retirement in order to get an explanation. The retired expert says that the double line is caused by a severe vibration, a vibration much greater than expected during normal flight, and between us, a vibration large enough to make a champagne glass dance on a tray table. So Finn starts looking for potential causes. Finn takes himself down to the lab where the wreckage is being reconstructed. And as you can see from these photos, it's a painstaking process putting the aircraft back together piece by piece. I think you've got to be a little bit obsessive and a little bit crazy to do this work. I'm a little bit obsessive and crazy, but not in this way. But it's important work, and Finn knows that the wreckage can tell you a lot, especially when the black box leaves very little to go on. Anyway, he meets with the team and he finds out that they are focusing their attention on the tail and the APU. So most aircraft have an auxiliary power unit, or an APU. The APU is used to provide power while on the ground before the engines are started up. It's usually located at the back of the aircraft and is not designed to operate in flight, except in rare situations such as an emergency. It's also why it might feel a little bit warm when you board an aircraft, especially if you're boarding from the back. So the reconstruction team have found evidence that the APU was in fact in operation during the flight. So, you know, the backup generator I told you about earlier, the one the pilot and the engineer decided to use, this was actually not really a backup generator. It was an undocumented feature of the APU. And not only was it running during flight, one of the struts attaching it to the aircraft was broken. So maybe maintenance records can provide some clues. Finn asked his team to focus their attention on the tail while reviewing them. Like, these are reams of paper printed. There's no Control F. You just got to go through it. So having somewhere to focus your attention is really helpful. And they find that one of the bolts connecting the tail to the fuselage was only replaced just a few weeks before the crash. So Finn checks back in with the reconstruction team. And now this is where the story, for me, gets really juicy, because what they uncover is a scandal that goes all the way to the White House. Well, the flying White House, Air Force One. President Clinton has just taken office, which I think is kind of fitting given the scandals that did follow him throughout his presidency, although he's not directly to blame for this one, though. So let's set the scene for the big reveal. 1993, Finn, he reaches into his bottom drawer of his desk. He pulls out a dusty bottle of aquavit and a small glass. It's a tradition of his to celebrate the conclusion of an investigation and to commemorate the victims. He takes a sip, pauses for a silent moment, and describes what happened one index finger at a time. The crash was caused by a loss of control due to the destruction of the tail. The destruction of the tail was caused by a long chain of factors resulting in a resonant vibration. The replacement of one of the bolts connecting the vertical fin to the fuselage 2 weeks before the crash altered the natural frequency of the tail section. Eventually, the frequency of the tail matched that of the running APU connected to a broken strut of poor quality and unknown origin. The resulting vibration grew in amplitude until it shook the tail section so hard that the bolts holding the fin to the fuselage sheared off, breaking the plane into 2 pieces. Without the stabilizing effects of the tail, the plane turned sharply and rolled out of the sky. Inspection of the sheared bolts showed that 3 of the 4 were not of the specified hardness and tensile strength. Further investigation showed that these bolts were counterfeit. After the publication of Finn's report in Norway, the US Aviation Authority, the FAA, they conducted their own investigation into the counterfeit air parts market. This was a mammoth investigation, and they found that the problem of counterfeit parts was so rampant that such parts were even found on Air Force One, supposedly the most scrutinized aircrafts in the world. And not only were the parts counterfeit, there was also a market for counterfeit FAA quality assurance tags, where suppliers of counterfeit parts would sign the name of known aircraft part inspectors. So as an operator, you could buy counterfeit parts and not even realize. Your only signal potentially would be the price. Now, it's tempting to scoff here and say they should have known. But if you were in the precarious financial position of Partnair, with your credit so bad that your pilots are paying the catering bills out of their own pockets, it would be all too tempting to just pay the lower cost, take a cursory look at the tag, and not ask too many questions. It's got the tag, you've done your job. Now, there is a lot to unpack in this case, and I just find it really fascinating from an engineering point of view. So fascinating that I read a 200-page report, and I put it in this neat little chart for you. So the long chain of seemingly unlikely events that ultimately cost 55 people their lives, and the incremental choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but were deadly in combination. So here again is the map of all of the events that contributed to the crash of Partnair Flight 394. You don't need to study it right now. I will be sharing my slides after the talk. but you can take a picture if you want. It's more to give an impression of the scale of the events and the relationships. You can see that the first decision that contributed to this disaster was 10 plus years before the crash. And we could call it a form of technical debt, if you allow the analogy. And if we follow the sequence of events until the end, we get 3 counterfeit bolts. Now, in my role as a software engineer, I work with open source software on the JVM. So by strict definition, you can argue that counterfeit isn't really possible. The original source code is available for download. No need to make an illegal copy of it. But let's think a bit more critically. What about code snippets that we copy and paste into our code base? Again, we scoff and say, yeah, everyone knows Stack Overflow is just a suggestion. We shouldn't blindly copy paste from it. But what about other sources of code snippets? Documentation, blogs, Git, community forums, conference slides. I have certainly blindly copied code into my project as a nervous junior working on yet another new technology, making myself feel better in the knowledge that I have code reviews and testing to back me up. The truth is, though, is that I'm responsible for every line of code that I write, and that includes code that I've copied and pasted. It's my duty to understand every line of it, pull it apart, dissect it, check what it's importing and why. And the reason I care about code quality is not because I want to get a pat on the head for being a perfect developer. The reason I care is because real people use the software that I contribute to. Teachers and school kids, in fact. So what can we learn from Finn and his team to help us improve the quality of the software that we contribute to? We can start by seeing outcomes as the result of a chain of events that we can learn from if we examine them. Taking our time to investigate all options. Often the time constraints we put on ourselves are fairly arbitrary. Sometimes they're not, but often they are. It could even be as simple as going to lunch before pushing your latest changes. Give yourself some time to process your solution. Maybe even clarify a couple of things with a colleague over lunch. Accepting responsibility for the code that we write and paste, so no counterfeit code. Not just because Git blame is a thing, but because you actually care about your users, your colleagues, and your future self. Following the evidence. Perhaps you have seen a similar issue before, but is it really the same? What assumptions are you making? Look at the current situation as it is, not as you want it to be. And of course, questioning ourselves and our opinions regularly and rigorously. So, before we move into the next case study and conclusions, I will share a small anecdote with you just to give a bit of background and how I got interested in this topic, and just so you can digest a little bit the first case study. So I took my first flight just before my 6th birthday. And I remember it really clearly. It was a 4-hour flight from Melbourne to Perth, flying with Ansett Airlines. Does anyone remember Ansett Airlines? Yes? Very nice. So back then, in the crazy time we called the 90s, where Ansett still existed, if you were a curious 6-year-old, it was not unusual to get invited into the cockpit mid-flight. I remember being in the cockpit and the pilot asked if I thought that it would be hotter or colder at 30,000 feet than on the ground. Now, my brother, he was 11 at the time, and he said colder. And I scoffed. What do you know? My 6-year-old logic told me hotter. We were in the sky, closer to the sun, so obviously it was hotter. The pilot pointed to a metal panel and asked me to touch it. It was ice cold. My brother laughed. So thankfully, my understanding of physics has changed since then. I understand that atmosphere is a thing and space and stuff. But my love of flying has not. And even as a fully grown adult, you will find me with my head pressed against the window, just looking around and taking it all in. For me, there's just something magical about being up there. And if you add in the curiosity of an engineer, well, you end up being a little bit of an aviation geek. Now, this might sound a little bit odd to hear given the seriousness of this topic, but this next case study is one of my favourites, and I am excited to share it with you. So it's 5:05 p.m. on a cold evening a few days after Christmas in 1978. The crew of United Airlines Flight 173 are preparing to land a fully laden DC-8 in Portland, Oregon. It's been an uneventful flight for the passengers from Denver, despite the usual Christmas chaos at the airport before departure. The first officer, Rod Beebe, aged 45, is the pilot flying. Excuse me. Although an experienced pilot, he is relatively new to the DC-8. This is a large, narrow-body aircraft, that means one aisle down the middle, with 4 jet engines and seating for 180 passengers. Now, it's a career milestone for him, which almost makes it worth being away from his young family so soon after Christmas. He's now down to an altitude of 10,000 feet, so he asked the captain and friend, Melvin McBroom, to lower the landing gear. McBroom obliges. Suddenly, a loud thump echoes through the aircraft. This is followed by a jarring vibration, a subtle pull of the nose of the plane to the right. Beebe and McBroom scan their instruments. The gear light is not illuminated. And unless the light is malfunctioning, that means that the gear is not fully extended. An error deploying the landing gear would actually explain what their sensors just told them. "What on earth was that?" yelps Second Officer Forrest Mendenhall, who goes by the nickname Frosty. Beebe and McBroom look at each other and then at Frosty and back at each other. They both know that the landing with the main gear not down is an extremely risky manoeuvre that could easily result in disaster. So it's time to put their training to use. Captain McBroom radios Portland Airport approach and tells them that Flight 173 will be staying at 5,000 feet and entering a holding pattern while they attempt to resolve the issue. They keep the speed steady at 170 knots. "We've got a gear problem. We'll let you know." Portland provides a heading for the hold. Over the next 25 minutes, the 3 men discuss and accomplish all relevant emergency and precautionary actions in an effort to reassure themselves that the gear is in fact down and locked. Frosty even enters the cabin for a visual confirmation of the wing indicators. They pop up when the gear pops down. And it's dark by now, but Frosty can see them easily. Frosty re-enters the cockpit to find Captain McBroom discussing the likelihood of an emergency landing with the head flight attendant, Joan Wheeler. An old-school gentleman, the captain doesn't want to frighten the passengers or hurry the girls, as he put it. He tells the ground that he and his crew will take their time and get everybody ready before attempting a landing at Portland Airport. The ground keeps them in a holding pattern. Joan returns to the cabin and, in unison with the rest of the cabin crew, calmly begins to take steps to maximise the chances of survival in an emergency landing. She knows the plane is in a safe holding pattern, so she can take her time and do everything by the book. In her 14 years as a United flight attendant, she has never had to prepare for such a landing, but she makes it look effortless. She patiently reminds people of the brace position. She asks able-bodied men to sit in front of the emergency exits. She instructs mothers on how to best wrap their babies. She reassures children. And please excuse me while I perpetuate gender roles here, but it was 1978, and this is how it happened. So in the cockpit, the 3 men continue exhausting all avenues to ensure that the gear is in fact down and locked. Yet in between directions from the captain, Bibi and Frosty are passing each other increasingly worried looks. It's now 5:55 p.m. and Flight 173 has been in a holding pattern now at low altitude with the gear down for 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. Bibi asks Frosty how much fuel is remaining. Frosty stutters, 4,000 pounds, one in each tank. Bibi does some quick math. At the current burn rate, they might have enough for 18 minutes. At that moment, the approach tower advises the next heading. It's towards the airport. Bibi breathes a quick sigh of relief. Surely, we're going in now. The captain, still focused on the gear, asks Frosty to do yet another sweep of the cabin to check how things are going. The captain's number one priority is a safe emergency landing with a fully prepared cabin. No surprises. Frosty obliges, but he would much prefer to assisting the flight deck as they make the final preparations for landing, which must only be a couple of minutes away. Frosty returns to the cockpit at 6:01 and tells the captain that the cabin is 2 or 3 minutes away from being ready. But at that moment, he feels the plane bank to the left, away from the airport. Shit, he thinks to himself, another hold. But before he can say anything, the captain asks about the welfare of the passengers. Hey, Frosty, how are they doing back there? Oh, yeah, they're pretty calm and cool. Some are more anxious than others. I did my best to reassure them while I was back there. The captain replies, okay, well, 2 minutes before landing, about 4 miles up, pick up the mic and tell them to assume the brace position. Frosty confirms, then takes the opportunity to gently remind the captain of the fuel situation. You know, you got 3,000 pounds of fuel and that's it. That equates to about 13 minutes. Without flinching, the captain advises Frosty on what to do if the gear collapses during landing. 4 more minutes pass. The captain sucks Frosty and Bibi into further conversation about the emergency landing and whether the gear is in fact down or not. Joan enters the cockpit and announces, well, I think we're ready. The captain acknowledges and advises they will be landing in about 5 minutes. While Captain wraps up the final details with Joan, Bibi addresses Frosty. Hey, buddy, I think you just lost number 4 engine. Joan thanks the captain and leaves the cockpit. Buddy, Bibi continues, I think you just lost an engine. This time, the captain is listening and he seems surprised. Why'd we lose an engine? Bibi utters just one word, the concern on his face as clear as day. Fuel. It's now 6:07 and finally the captain asks for a heading back towards the airport. The plane starts banking to the left. Engine number 3 stops. The official term is a flame out. Now the fuel situation has the captain's attention. He asks Frosty to open the cross feeds. This allows whatever fuel is left to power the 2 remaining engines. The captain insists that the tank that was feeding engine number 3 still has 1,000 pounds of fuel. Tensions heighten as the captain keeps barking at Frosty about the cross feeds and the extra 1,000 pounds of fuel that doesn't exist. So that's 6.5 minutes. They have 5 minutes of fuel left, tops. And sure enough, 4 minutes later, at 6:13, engine 1 and 2 begin to splutter. Flame out is inevitable. Finally, the captain declares a Mayday. Within seconds, the plane clips a tree and then another before ploughing into some power distribution cables. The plane slows as the wires stretch before crashing into 2 unoccupied homes and coming to rest in a field. There is no fire. Kind of need fuel for a fire. Most of the 181 passengers on board, including a prisoner come fugitive, exit the plane physically unharmed. This prisoner, believe it or not, actually helped the survivors to flee the aircraft before he fled the scene. The captain and Bibi are among the survivors, injured but alive. Frosty and Joan, along with 8 others, are dead. The next morning, The newspapers hit the stands, and without yet knowing what has happened in the cockpit, the media labels Captain McBroom a hero, citing the miraculous landing without injuries or deaths of people on the ground, which is actually pretty miraculous. Survivors praise the flight attendants for their preparedness and for the orderly evacuation. It could have been a lot worse. But why did it happen in the first place? United Airlines Flight 173 is arguably the most important crash in aviation history. If you ever took a flight after 1985, then I guarantee you that your safety has been impacted by this flight. And in the final report, investigators list a probable cause for this crash as well as a contributing factor. The cause was the captain's failure to properly monitor the aircraft's fuel state and to respond to both the low fuel state and the crew members' advisories regarding the fuel state. The factor contributing to the accident was the failure of Bibi and Frosty to either fully comprehend the criticality of the fuel state or to successfully communicate their concern to the captain. The most alarming part of these findings was that they were not isolated. They were only the latest in a string of air crashes with similar causes. In the 60s and 70s, the number of flights were growing dramatically, as were the number of crashes. For example, the most famous crash before Flight 173 was probably the Tenerife airport disaster in 1977. In this crash, two fully laden 747s collided on the runway, killing 583 passengers and crew. Similar to Flight 173, the probable cause in this crash was a breakdown in communication. Only this time it was both inside and outside of the two cockpits. Air traffic control also played a role. So in this broader context, the recommendations from Flight 173 were timely. NASA had already identified the issue of human error in the cockpit and were working on a solution called Crew Resource Management, or CRM. Yeah, I know hearing that acronym might make you shudder a bit if you've ever worked on customer relationship management system, but for today, it means crew resource management. And in the investigation report of Flight 173, airlines were told to give this training to their pilots. Specifically, the crew resource management training should have two themes: participative management for captains, in other words, providing a non-threatening environment that actively encourages collaboration. And secondly, assertiveness training for other cockpit crew members. So this is how to get your point across effectively in a non-threatening manner. And while it originally started in the cockpit, these days cabin crew and ground crew are expected to have the training. Basically, any team involved with the safe operation of the aircraft get the training. Now, in modern organisational terms, you could summarise crew resource management as ensuring psychological safety in the cockpit, the cabin, the ground. Now, I find this really interesting as this recommendation actually predates the term psychological safety by about 20 years. And what's also really interesting is the emphasis on the assertiveness of the co-pilots. So it's not just the responsibility of the captain to provide a safe space, it's the other crew members also taking responsibility for how their message or advice is received. And in the decades that have followed the implementation of CRM, starting with United Airlines in 1981, makes sense they'd be first, indeed the culture of aviators has changed markedly. It's no longer a case of captain knows best. Every young pilot knows, no matter their experience level, that they not only have the right, they have the responsibility to speak up when something is not right. Now, you could argue in software the stakes aren't as high as human lives, But what if your failure to speak up sparks a chain of events that results in a data breach or loss of faith with a major customer, or potentially worse, loss of faith in yourself? And of course, being prepared to speak up is different from knowing when to speak up. How can you better tell if things are wrong or require further examination? That decisions are being made that ignore key evidence. We already got some tips from Finn and the team in Norway, but what about Captain McBroom? Captain McBroom can teach us a lot about situational awareness. This is a fundamental concept for aviators. Put simply, situational awareness is knowing what's going on around you. In the case study, we saw Captain McBroom getting increasingly fixated on the landing gear issue, which left him unable to process the criticality of the fuel situation. He had lost his situational awareness. And if you are the proud owner of a human brain, it's very easy to lose your situational awareness, much easier than we would like to admit. For example, have you ever dived into an issue so deep and got caught in the technical wonder that you lost sight of what the problem was in the first place? Or were you so focused on getting to the conference on time that you can't really recall a lot of your journey? As an engineer, if you fail to maintain awareness of your situation, you end up with a perfectly engineered feature that nobody wants, or a hotfix for a small ordering issue that leaves your app unable to process payments. So how can we maintain situational awareness in our roles as software professionals? This is a list I've adopted from crew resource management training, interpreted in the software engineering context. So you can maintain situational awareness by considering the impact of stress and your workload on performance. For example, how many tickets are assigned to you right now? How many meetings do you have planned? Which deadlines are real and which are arbitrary? Be honest with yourself and with others on what you can accomplish. Having appreciation of the automation and abstractions present. Are you aware of the abstractions that you interact with, even if only on a rudimentary level? Could you find the resources you need if the situation required it? Do you have a basic understanding of what happens when you run a job in your CI/CD pipeline, for example? What is it doing and what could go wrong? Paying attention to and meeting your physiological needs. Did you sleep enough? Are you hydrated? Did you eat? Did you poop? Recognizing that you carry around preconceptions and bias wherever you go. Is your gut instinct actually just bias? Why does a certain course of action appeal to you over another? What evidence do you have to support your position? Evidence against. Being aware of your limitations, for example, as they relate to your abilities, experience, or training, and communicating them when relevant. What are your limitations or weak spots with respect to your role? How can you patch them? Who can help you? And what knowledge could you share with others to patch their weak spots? And crucially, maintaining situational awareness does not have to be a solo endeavour, because by encouraging an environment where everyone can speak up, share knowledge, and challenge ideas, then you lift the situational awareness of your team and organisation, your crew. And this has been known in practice for years in aviation already, leads to better decision making and better results. My name is Adele, and thank you so much for your time. So We have plenty of time for questions. I know asking in front of group is not for everybody, that's fine. We'll also be around for the rest of the conference to get the blessed spot of the first session. So I'm around stress-free for the next 3 days, but happy to answer some questions now. All right. Oh, we have one at the front. Hang, just wait 1 second for the microphone, just for the people at home, I assume.
So at the end of the day, was the landing gear ever down?
Yes. I deliberately leave that detail out for a question for the keen observer, so you spotted it, well done. Yes, it was down, which I think highlights the fixation issue a little better even, that the thing that he was so worried about was actually fine. He'd done everything he could, and he should have moved his attention onto, or kept his attention with actually flying the plane.
Based on that, do we know if the landing gear being down assisted with the safer landing that did occur?
Well, absolutely. So yeah, they had a fully prepared cabin, and so if they had crashed from some other reason, the number of casualties probably would have been higher. So the fact that they have a fully prepared cabin did increase the survival rate, but the position in these aircraft investigations is always, why did we get to that point of that having to happen? And if not running out of fuel would have actually meant that everybody lived, not just most of them.
So if the landing gear was down, what caused the warning lights?
Well, it could have been broken.
Could have been broken.
Yeah.
They didn't do the flicker.
Yeah, it could have been broken. I'm not sure the exact reason. I think it just could have been broken, or it could have just been a miswiring or something. But yeah, it just, that's why I said specifically in the talk that if the light wasn't broken, then the landing gear wasn't down. So that's also another lesson there of, the level of trust you have in your instruments and finding other ways to verify the information you're getting. Yep.
Yep, I've got a question. So when you say assertiveness for other members,
Yeah.
it's their responsibility to not only speak up, but also to do so in a safe manner. How would you propose going about that?
Well, starting a sentence with "you're wrong and here's why" is maybe not the best approach. And I'll be honest here, I can be a little bit too direct. That's why I do so well in the Netherlands, because they're just super direct and it works for me. But it would be, I suppose, if you to have enough, I guess, evidence for your position. So you can just say something, I respectfully disagree with your position. I've noticed this. I think it goes a bit contrary to our line of our direction of solving the problem at the moment. I would feel more comfortable if we could consider these points before we move forward. I'm also happy to have a more extended conversation on the floor if you'd like. All right, well, I'm not going to hold you for any longer than you want. Get a start on the barista, because I think if all the other sessions are ending, you might want to go to the barista first. So thank you so much for attending, and happy to answer any of your questions on the floor. Thank you.